having hundreds, thousands, millions of followers, but then really knowing only few, two, maybe one, or no one. Summoning literally any food, anytime, anywhere. The hustle, the grind, the crunch, businesses turning your dopamine against you to make as much money as possible. Light, dark, cool, warm, just flip a switch. Knowing the size of the universe and how it's all going to end. To your primitive brain, you might as well be living in an alien world. So, does this make you, modern human living in modern times, more or less likely to have mental disorders compared to your great, 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 and then you say that 400 times, grandparents who may have lived simpler lives? This is a very complicated topic, and to help us navigate it, I have a special guest with me. He recently reviewed the subject and has been part of efforts to study behaviors of some hunter-gatherer societies in Africa and Asia. Dr. Nikhil Chaudhary, a lecturer in human evolutionary anthropology from the University of Cambridge. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So my first question is, how can we find out if we have more mental disorders in the modern age compared to our ancestors? Is how would you even test this? Like, I feel like you'd need a time machine, right? And then you need to speak their language. You need to know their cultures, behavior. You need to have a psychiatry certificate as someone from more than 10,000 years ago, and then be like, okay, that's what disorders they have.
So you're right. It's very difficult. And all of those things would definitely help make firmer conclusions. But usually, or at least in this case, when we're trying to infer something about the cognition or behavior of our ancestors, we can study contemporary hunter-gatherers. So we lived as hunter-gatherers. That was the way of life. We had no agriculture, practiced no cultivation for the vast majority of our evolutionary history. It was only about 10,000 years ago that we started practicing agriculture. But given that we live this way of life, we can now look at the contemporary hunter-gatherers who still, there are a few remaining hunter-gatherer societies around the world. And when we look at, for example, whether mental disorders exist there, we can extrapolate from that and say, okay, well, we see them here. And given their way of life is so similar to how our ancestors live, perhaps our ancestors suffered or did not suffer from similar conditions. And as for the psychiatry point, just to say, yes, I don't have a psychiatry certificate, but I work alongside a team at the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK.
Yes, you've spent some time with hunter-gatherer societies, from my understanding. Like, where have you been exactly? What tribes have you been involved in? Have you met?
So I mainly work with Bayaka hunter-gatherers who live in Congo. So they live in the rainforests of northern Congo. And my team generally works with that population. And then we also work with another population in the Philippines who are coastal hunter-gatherers. They're known as the Agta.
I see. Now, I feel like you guys are running out of time here. Because from my understanding, I'm not sure, you correct me if I'm wrong, hunter-gatherer societies, tribes, are more and more integrating themselves with modern society. So eventually this is going to be almost impossible to study. Am I correct?
Yeah, there are a lot of caveats and things we need to be aware of when trying to extrapolate from hunter-gatherers now to the past. But also, as you say, one of the important issues there is to what degree are they still living a hunter-gatherer way of lifestyle, and how market integrated are they? How much are they interacting with other populations? And yes, that has changed substantially, even whilst I've been working with the Bayaka for about 10 years. And that has changed substantially even over the last decade, but it's been changing for several decades before that. And usually you
Do they
see,
like
well, you
go to
see a
like
spectrum.
supermarkets now or something like that?
No, I mean,
Not
you
yet.
see, for example, where I work, you see a spectrum. There will be some communities who are still living in the forest very remotely, relying almost entirely on hunting and gathering and fishing, and maybe a little bit of trade with neighboring farming populations. But they're very remote. We have to travel many hours into the forest to get to them. And then at the other end of the spectrum, at least where I work, you've got communities who are living in this logging village. So it's a logging town which has been set up by the logging company which operates there. And they're still foraging, so they're still hunting and gathering somewhat. But then there's also a market there, so they've got some opportunity to buy food rather than just forage for it themselves. There's even a school there. Now, it's not, they don't have routine attendance to school where everyone goes every day, but there will be some kids who go to that school.
All right. So we better find out if there's a definitive answer to this question very fast. Um,
Yeah,
so I wanted to ask, is there a definitive answer? Like if I asked you,
yeah.
do we have modern humans living in industrial societies, do we have uh, more, are we more susceptible to mental disorders compared to hunter gatherer societies? Are you able to give me a yes, no, likely, maybe, not likely?
Well, the answer's never simple. My guess, by guess, my educated, informed guess would be the prevalence of disorders will be different. With some disorders, maybe it's higher. With some disorders, maybe it's lower. And the risk factors for those disorders will vary.
I see.
So it's certainly not the case that, hunter-gatherer societies or ancestral societies had no mental health problems. I think that's pretty unlikely. But prevalence rates may be different, and risk factors may be different.
Now, we live in a completely different time. Like, I'm a bit biased here. I'm not gonna lie. I feel like, as I said, we live in an alien world, and um, how do I say this? Because we live in an alien world, our brain sometimes might not be able to adapt to certain things, and that there's not enough time,
Yeah.
evolutionary speaking, to make any kind of adjustments. Has there been enough time for our brains to adjust to our current way of life?
Yes, so I think the point you make is very valid, and I think again it's not a one size fits all case, right? There are some, the speed with which natural selection operates will vary based on many factors, and there are some aspects of our neurology and our psychology which will have adapted very quickly to the changes in our lifestyles. There's some which may not have adapted as quickly. And importantly, there's some which were always flexible. So they weren't very much set in stone, but various preferences or psychological mechanisms might have been sort of programmed such that they operate under heuristics, like under conditions A, behave this way, under conditions B, behave that way. So when you've got that plasticity, there's less of this risk. But
So, what you're saying is that our brain has the ability to adapt, not evolutionary, but has mechanisms to adapt to certain new things, but there's other certain things it might not.
yeah. And it is evolutionary because even that flexibility, which exists in some domains, that is a product of evolution, right? There are advantages to having a flexible plastic brain, and that's something evolution has endowed us with. But yes, you're correct. There are some cases where there's not much flexibility. Natural selection has been slow. I mean, the really classic textbook example of this is our preferences for sugars and fats. You know, we get a lot of positive, feedback in terms of our neurology and our psychology and our hormones when we eat foods which are high in sugar and fats, because these were scarce over our evolutionary history. They were very beneficial and nutritious, But now we live in this environment where they're abundant and they're much more likely to cause problems of obesity and heart disease. But natural selection hasn't had that time to adjust our preferences. So
Have you met any member of hunter gatherer tribe that was on a diet?
no, no. I
It
think
never happens, huh?
there's much more more likely for that they're malnourished than in terms of not having enough nourishment than being overnourished. But no, never heard of a diet.
Have you ever met a hunter gatherer who needed to exercise?
Well, no, they all need to exercise, but they all do the exercise, so they're fulfilling that need that all humans have.
I want to know about before we get into the mental disorder thing, like the average human today works what, maybe 40, 50 hours a week. Like when it comes to hunter gatherers, do they work as much as we do? Or do you have any idea about that? What was your experience like?
Yeah, there's a bit of debate around this insofar as in the 60s and 70s, um, there was a researcher called Marshall Salins who talked about the original affluent society. And he talked about how hunter gatherers don't work that hard. They've got everything they need. They're not sort of have these capitalist structures where they're continually wanting more. And he would cite something like 16 hours of work a week. And then as we looked more into the data, it was like, it seemed that he had only accounted for certain things like going out foraging. What about getting firewood? What about building huts or making tools and so on? So he had underestimated it. I would say there's huge variation in how much hunter gatherers work. It largely depends on the ecology, what foods are available. You have some societies where men might be hunting 6 hours a day. They're heavily reliant on meat, and women aren't focused that much on foraging, but they're doing other works. And then you have other societies where maybe both men and women forage for about 3 hours a day. So there's a lot of variation. I would say they work less than a 40-hour week, though.
In general,
Yeah.
they work less than us. 40 hours,
It's,
that's like maybe in 1960. These days, you'd be lucky if it's less than 50. How many
yeah,
hours do you work?
it varies a lot throughout the year,
It varies a
um,
lot.
from
I've
nothing
worked
to every
with
working
doctors.
minute.
I have gotten emails from professors at 2 a.m. in the morning. I don't know how you guys do it.
Well, professors also have strange sleeping habits. I don't go to bed till 3 a.m. in
Okay,
the
all
morning,
right.
but I don't wake up
Um,
either.
actually, this moves me on to my next question. But there are so many variations between tribes. I mean, people who are hunter gatherers, for example, live in the North Pole, are going to have completely different
Yeah.
lifestyles than someone who lives in the Amazon jungle. Um, and maybe each tribe has different stressors that cause different mental illness. For example, if I was a young boy, maybe in the, hopefully I'm saying this correctly, Satiri Maui tribe. Are you
Okay.
familiar with them? They
Of
have
them, yeah.
a rite of passage where they have to be stung by one of the most painful stings in the world, by bullet ants. And they have to do a dance while doing that. And they have to do this, I believe, 20 times. Um, so, as a young boy, for example, growing in that tribe, maybe I'd have more anxiety and stress than another tribe where they don't have possibly this kind of rite of passage. What do you think about that? What would you
Yeah.
say is
I think that's a specific event, and I generally wouldn't characterize someone's mental well-being around one specific event that happens in their life. Especially when we're thinking at population levels, yes, he's probably anxious about that. And that anxiety is probably quite acute building up to the actual event. But if we really want to assess, oh, well, what are the anxiety levels amongst boys in that society? I probably wouldn't characterize it around such a small event. My sense of the overall levels of uniformity in terms of mental disorders across societies, across hunter-gatherer societies, is yes, inevitably there'll be variation. Um, I'm trying to think of an example of what might cause that variation. I mean, much stronger than the variation is, I think there would be a lot more similarity in the prevalence rates and risk factors amongst all hunter-gatherers when considered in contrast to us living in industrialized societies. So yes, there'll always be variation across populations and smaller cultural differences. But I would imagine in the sort of question we're interested in here, which is overall trends, there will really be something to pick out there such that there's much smaller variation between hunter-gatherers than between hunter-gatherers versus industrialized societies.
So there's quite a few mental disorders these days because we figured out what they are, right?
Sure.
There's a lot of research to know that anxiety is anxiety, depression is depression, and so on and so forth. Is it possible that some mental disorders were actually useful in the lives of hunter-gatherers? For example, if you're chronically anxious, for example, instead of, you're being anxious because your boss is not the best person in the world, you're anxious because something might actually hurt you, right? Maybe that actually helps people who are in tribes survive. What do you think of that? Is there like mental disorders which are
Yeah.
not exactly as bad to us in the modern world?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to respond to a couple of the points you made there, when you say we've now sort of identified what mental disorders are, and we know now anxiety is anxiety. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I mean, we construct the idea of a disorder based on when someone is experiencing certain psychological states or exhibiting certain behaviors that reduce their ability to function in society or in a in a socially acceptable manner. And really, that is sometimes we create arbitrary thresholds there. And I don't think you can really think of like, this is depression, this is anxiety. These are constructs which are useful for identifying when we want to intervene based on someone's psychological state. I don't think there is such a thing as anxiety or such a thing as depression. And I think there are various problems with that way of thinking, and we've got quite obsessed with it. As for whether some of the psychological states, which we see as pathological now, had utility then, I think so. In some cases, I mean, in some cases, maybe they even have utility now because utility in the sense of the currency of natural selection, which is about survival and reproduction. It's not about happiness or well-being, psychological well-being. And that's an important distinction. Some things we think of as disorders now are disorders because they affect well-being, but they're still maybe biological processes functioning for the reasons they evolved. As for giving some examples of how that may be the case, you mentioned anxiety. Yeah, inevitably, the idea with anxiety is it's always better. I think a nice way to think of it is what this psychiatrist, who also is the godfather of evolutionary medicine, Randolph Nesse, he talked about the smoke detector principle. And if you're designing any sort of system, any sort of hazard detection system, it's always better that that system makes false positive errors, i.e., it thinks there's danger even if there wasn't, as compared to a false negative error when there is danger and it doesn't detect it, right? You'd rather have a smoke alarm which goes off unnecessarily sometimes, but it does catch fires when they are there, versus having a smoke alarm which doesn't make these false alarms, but actually sometimes it misses real fires. So we've sort of been shaped by natural selection to be slightly anxious. It's always better to overestimate risks. And usually that could provide an advantage, but then it's all a continuum, and you get past a point in time that even in a hunter-gatherer environment, chronic anxiety about very small risks is probably not going to be adaptive. But you can understand
So
why the vulnerability is there.
So my question is, let's say, for example, I take someone who has chronic anxiety, not too much, they're functional, and I take a modern human who's happy-go-lucky, positive all the time, and I teleport them back in time to, let's say, a jungle.
Yeah.
Okay, and one of them, this is a common example. Both of them hear a sound, and it's like they're not sure exactly what it is. One of them thinks it's a tiger; they're very anxious, and the other, just wind. Right? It's nothing.
Yeah.
The anxious individual is likely to survive, right, and pass on his genes, and the not so anxious person isn't likely to survive. Is this an oversimplification, would you say, or
I think
is that correct?
that's correct, right? It's effectively, when it comes to hazard detection, it's always better to be a bit more paranoid than being slightly optimistic, right? That is usually the case. But as you say, it's really about, are they functioning? Once it gets to the point where you're not leaving your home because you're worried about everything and you're living in the jungle, then you're probably better off being a bit optimistic, because at least you'll go out, you'll find a mate, you'll reproduce, and maybe you die a bit early, but that's still better than staying in your hut for the whole of your life. So it's always a matter of degree. But I think, yes, that heuristic always works. Better to be slightly anxious than complacent.
All right. So, as you said, actually, you didn't say that. I'm saying this. If we are more likely to have more mental disorders, and the general trend is that's likely a possibility, um, compared to hunter gatherers, at least we have ways of dealing with it, right? I can go to a psychiatrist. He can prescribe me Prozac. I can do cognitive behavioral therapy. But if there's a hunter gatherer and they have depression, what do they do? Like, are they going to have to deal with it the rest of their lives? Like, how do they deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, it raises an interesting question, right? Because we don't actually know whether it's common for them to get depression, or at least what we conceive of as depression. Of course, they don't have access to medication, but there are other they have other ways of dealing with physical and mental illnesses. You have traditional healers. The way society operates and the level of social support is much higher. I mean, whether the remedies and, in particular, the medications we use in industrialized societies, their efficacy varies a lot, both between disorders and between individuals. So you have some disorders where a medication is probably going to do its job fairly predictably. And then when you think about something like antidepressants, there's huge variation in whether they're going to work for someone or not. And I'd say often, at least for a number of disorders, having a strong social support system who can help you through problems might be more consistently effective than some of the pharmacological interventions we use. That's certainly not always the case. But they have other social ways of dealing with these. They also use medicinal plants. Now, among the Bayaka, I spoke to an Unganga who's a traditional healer and was asking him, "Oh, do you have any plants that you use when people have problems?" Sort of, I was trying to get at problems of the mind rather than the body, which is a very hard concept to get across. But at least to communicate around without the right vocabulary. But my sense from him was nothing stood out to him. So I'm not sure the Bayaka are using medicinal plants for any sort of psychological problems, but I think they probably have real social support systems and remedies which can help to attenuate any symptoms.
I know this is maybe a bit of an stretch, but maybe the power of belief might be able to, because in this day and age, right, if you have depression, for example, someone might say it's just a chemical imbalance, deal with it, or something like that. Here are some
Yeah,
Prozac, and then they don't actually deal with the actual environmental problem that they
yeah,
have. that might be causing the issue. But someone who is in a hunter-gatherer tribe, they don't know what um, if there is medication for depression, or any treatment for that. So you might have a traditional healer who tells them, for example, do this ritual or do that, and that's going to help you get better. So their maybe thought process is a bit different on what's going to make them better than someone who lives in modern society. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that is the case, and that's sort of what I meant by support systems. And I don't think there's enough work really identifying, at least in hunter-gatherer society, certainly not in terms of the evolutionary researchers who I'm aware of, trying to identify exactly how these sort of issues may be managed in terms of ritual. But I do think belief and, um, really, sometimes I think of these things as placebos. Placebos work, whether it's with medication, but the more the more intense the placebo, so to speak, the more of an experience it is, and the more salient it is to the patient, the more effective it is. And if you're engaging in some sort of ritual with 50 other people and you're the center of attention and it's very active, that's going to be really salient. So I think the sort of placebo effect is very large there. And now when we're thinking about placebo effects with respect to psychological symptoms, I mean, is a placebo effect really a placebo effect, or is it actually just a remedy? So, yes, I think ritual probably is one of the ways lots of hunter-gatherer societies are likely to deal with such problems. They may also just interpret them quite differently. There's a lot of speculation, at least, that psychosis may be not seen as dysfunctional. Maybe it's a particular ability, and you get shame and status or some sort of prestige for being in contact with the forest or being in contact with ancestors. So it's also the way that the society treats the symptoms is going to determine the experience in and of itself. So, and that's why we really need to be careful about having this idea, this is schizophrenia, this is depression. I mean, is it really a disorder if you actually gain prestige from having hallucinations? Yeah, so that's a long way around your question, but the short answer is I don't really think enough work is being done on this, but I imagine your speculation is correct, and that actually in non-pharmacological interventions that you see in these social groups via ritual, etc., are probably quite effective with some disorders.
So when it comes to mental disorders, so as we mentioned before, they might cause you not to function in modern society, but if you're living in a tribe, you're fine. Like you might have the same exact disorder, but they might impart a benefit on you, and they might not be as bad to your functioning in their
Yeah,
society as we live today. Um, this is a dark question. I know actually searched Control F to see if there was anywhere in the review that you wrote, and I didn't see this. I would like to talk about suicide.
sure,
I hope that's okay. So,
sure.
the gender paradox of suicide, for example, is that men, they commit less suicide attempts, but they're more successful at it. They use more lethal ways, like a gun, for example.
Hmm.
Women, they do something else. They try to poison themselves, for example, with drugs or any of that. Now, have you ever come across cases of suicide in hunter-gatherer societies? Is that even apparent? Has there been any research? Are you aware of that you're aware of?
No quantitative research on that, but I tried to get at it on my last trip informally. I asked lots of older individuals whether they knew of anyone who had committed suicide, and yeah, no one knew of anybody. I think they'd be honest with me. I knew them very well. It didn't appear to me that it would be a very taboo subject, at least um, in the context that we were having the discussion. And none of the people I discussed it with had heard of anyone committing suicide. Now,
Interesting.
you need suicide. Of course, suicide rates aren't high, where it's still a low rate, right? So you need to ask that question very widely to start to create estimates. And maybe if the people I was speaking to, but the thing is, word travels very quickly in these communities. It's amazing because also they're mobile, so people are coming and going between different camps and communities. So news spreads fast. So I would imagine the people I asked, they would have heard if anyone in that region had committed suicide. And by that region, I'm talking about this specific region, which probably includes over 1,000 people. But self-report, we don't have the same sort of data on it. There are no hospitals keeping recordings of this. So, yeah, my intuition based on that is that suicide rates are much lower.
So, what the prevalence of depression? Is there any comparison, like at all,
Sure.
between hunter-gatherer societies and modern humans? Do you have any knowledge of that?
Okay, a few points. Just quickly, I should emphasize contemporary hunter-gatherers are modern humans, right? They're modern humans in evolutionary terms.
Humans living
in humans living in industrialized societies. Yeah, so I should always clarify that.
Is what you call it.
Yes, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. But yes,
correct,
I should always emphasize that contemporary hunter-gatherers are modern humans and the same species as us, and sometimes that can get lost, which is dangerous. And just to follow up on the suicide point, I should mention that during transition, there are certainly reports of suicide in other societies once hunter-gatherers start undergoing transition and increased integration or are forced to settle, because this transition comes with a lot of difficulties like alcoholism or exploitation or, being kicked out of their land. So then, but I don't tie that to hunter-gatherer subsistence. That's the stresses of transition away from hunter-gatherer subsistence. Going to your question about depression, one of the few studies that has been done, and as I say, there's a real dearth of research into this, was on postpartum depression amongst the Hadza, who are a hunter-gatherer society from Tanzania. The sample size was incredibly small. It was only about 22 mothers or something. But they used this Edinburgh postnatal depression scale, which is used in lots of different, has been used in rural areas and in lots of countries. And they actually found a very high rate of postpartum depression scores on this scale amongst the Hadza. And primarily, this seemed to be, perhaps you could argue an artifact, or you could argue, well, that's just the reality, a consequence of mothers being worried and anxious about the high risk the high levels of infant mortality. Now, to me, pathologizing that is a real, infant mortality is really high, and being worried about it makes complete sense and is understandable. And to start thinking of that as postpartum depression, if that's really boosting scores on postpartum depression scales, it is perhaps misleading. But in that regard, there were high rates. As for estimates of depression prevalence, and by that I just mean major depression or depressive episodes, there's not really any good data on it. I'm giving you this answer a lot, but that's just this field is just emerging, and unfortunately the work and data just isn't there. There is some work that has been done with the Chimane, who are somewhat hunter-gatherers, but they're really not fully living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Because a large part of their diet comes from working in fields and practicing small-scale cultivation. But amongst the Chimane, rates of depression were relatively similar, I would say, higher than maybe around 10% or a bit higher. And that's a point prevalence. So that is quite high. But again, it's about really dissecting what's going on there, because the symptoms were largely somatic. So they, rather than necessarily being a sense of existential dread or a sense of hopelessness, they were more around lethargy and lack of appetite and lack of interest in being active or engaging activities. And there's one hypothesis that in these societies and generally, depression can serve as a sickness behavior. So if you're under any immune stress or you've got an infection, as we all know, right, we should rest. And the symptoms, the somatic symptoms of depression would be very useful there. You're not exposing yourself to
additional stress or
but
risks.
yeah, by having a low appetite, there's lower risk of gut infections. By being hypersomnia is good, but it's all about reallocation of energy towards the immune system. So again, the
So this goes,
depression rates may be high or higher, but it's very much, it's probably not what we are thinking about in terms of depression, and where the focus is often in our society is focused around low mood as opposed to lethargy and fatigue, etc.
so this goes back to the idea that certain parts of mental disorders in modern society might actually be beneficial
Yeah.
for hunter-gatherers and vice versa,
And
right?
even in modern society, right, it's still beneficial if you've got an infection to have a suite of changes that are going to make you reallocate energy to the immune system. If you were ill in an industrialized society, if you've got a serious infection at least, it's good to feel tired all the time, to sleep all the time, maybe depending on the infection, to have a lower appetite to either starve the virus or to avoid exposure to certain microbes. It's good to maybe be socially withdrawn and not spread the infection. So even still in industrialized societies, we see a link between inflammation and certain depressive symptoms, and that may well serve a function even now.
What do you think, like, if you see the way hunter-gatherers live in general, and you see the way we live in industrial societies, what's something that hunter-gatherers do that's really possibly shielding them from certain mental illnesses, maybe depression, that we as an industrial society really do badly? All right.
Yeah.
What would you say, like, number one or number two things, if you
I'd
had to think?
split it into two categories. One is the social life, and I'll come to that in a moment. And one is sort of the more general lifestyle. So in the general lifestyle, they're quite obvious suspects here. Their sleep is, of course, synchronized with the sun. There's not really artificial light. And then, their physical activity levels are way higher than ours. So sleep and physical activity, we know, are huge, disturbances to them, or a lack of physical activity is a huge risk factor. And equally, sorting out your sleep and sorting out and doing exercise have huge remedial effects too. So that is just without question something we're doing very badly. Now, the other aspect, which I think is just as important, is the social world. So social isolation is incredibly common in industrialized societies, and perhaps it's good for me to really isolate here weird societies, Western industrialized societies, because industrialized societies in the East, sometimes the societies are still very collectivist, and this isn't as much of an issue. But in the West, you see very common for people to be isolated. Chronic loneliness is a problem, and a lack of social support is a major risk factor for almost every psychiatric disorder. It may be less so for certain really early onset disorders like autism, for example, but certainly mood disorders and other disorders lack of social support or a weak social network or social isolation is a huge risk factor. The hunter gatherers live communally. They live in camps of, say, 50 individuals. Often they'll have access to extended family living, in these camps. Social isolation. Social isolation just doesn't exist there, right? You just cannot, as a hunter gatherer, you have to live in a group. If you live by yourself, you just won't survive for various
But what about
reasons.
like, you have people with like millions of followers and they have so many friends, and they still somehow they get depressive symptoms, and they may take it next a next step and commit suicide. Um, so how can there be social isolation with social media these days? Like it's you can know so many people.
Well, I think it just comes down to isolation. Perhaps is not always the right term. It really depends whether you would count someone as socially isolated, or discard them as socially isolated just because they had followers, right? It's not real social interaction in a physical sense. And what is the quality of those social relationships? There's so much work in social media, and I think really, often it's more negative interactions. You can go on any post or any Facebook video and look at the comments. It's very negative. There's a lot of reputational concern. There's a lot of social comparison. So the quality, this is not really social support. This isn't having access to a strong social support network. They're actually getting all the negative aspects of social, not just negative, right? You get to stay in touch with your extended family because you can talk to them on Zoom. But if you're looking at Instagram or something and you're considering judgment from people you might not even know who are posting nasty comments, this isn't a remedy to social isolation. This is just a
Would
different
you would
form of it.
you would you agree with this? You know the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Does it take a village to avoid mental disorders?
Yeah. Again, we just cannot social
Most
isolation.
mental.
It really depends on the disorder. Certainly having a village, living in a camp, and having a strong social network would improve outcomes in most disorders, more so in some than others. As for raising children, yes, I think that really is a huge impact on particularly maternal mental health, and also probably child mental health problems for various reasons. I mean, in the UK and other Western societies, again, the biggest risk factor, or at least the most well established risk factor up there, is lack of social support as a risk factor for postnatal depression, right? Because the focus is on the parents, particularly the mothers. The fathers go back to work relatively quickly, and this is just so unusual for a woman to manage looking after an infant by herself without support. In hunter gatherer
It's insanity. Yeah.
societies where I work, and this is some of the stuff I've got coming out over the next months, and papers looking at child rearing network sizes, and the kids are being raised by being raised. I mean, they might have 15 caretakers over the course of a day, um, or 10 actually doing real hands-on care, and mothers are only responsible for about half of the child's care. And importantly, some of the really distressing aspects and difficult aspects of childcare, like if you've got a child who's crying a lot, mothers get so much support. They are only attending to a crying child about 40 to 50% of the time. The rest of the time, someone else helps or takes over with that, so mothers get some rest. And this all has implications for child development and well-being too, but that's a separate issue.
That's the crazy idea to me. Like, if you are a single mother and you have a baby, like I'm not a mother, I have a kid, and when he cries for a long time, I tend to disconnect. Right, I need some help. And then you have single mothers who are expected to work like two jobs and then raise kids, and then when they are having problems mentally, they're just told get over it. Like, you can do this. You're strong. Just just don't have a disorder. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Is that what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think what's even more crazy to me is sometimes the narrative there does invoke, at least implicitly, evolutional biology, because the narrative is that mothers have maternal instincts and they should know how to look after the kids and they can manage it all by themselves. And that's the natural way. They naturally use their maternal instincts to know how to do everything and to manage alone. But if there is a natural way, I don't like that word, but it is certainly cooperative childcare, right? All evolutionary anthropologists and ethologists generally refer to humans as either cooperative breeding or something along those lines, which highlights that what has been so fundamental to our success as a species is the fact that children are raised by many individuals other than their parents. I mean, if you think about, unlike other great apes, for example, human women have more babies and higher survival rates. This is an evolutionary paradox. Usually, the more kids you have, the lower the average survival rate because you can invest less in each of them. But when we compare humans to other apes, we have more kids and higher survival rates. And the reason for that is because so many people help look after the kids and ensure the survival. And as such, the mother, who isn't the sole caretaker, can have another child and another child because she's got all this support. So we somehow combined having lots of kids with high survival, all because childcare, fundamentally, human childcare evolved to be a cooperative venture.
So, based on what I heard from you, before I want you to react to a couple of clips in just a minute. Basically, being an individualistic society, and no physical activity, not enough sleep, bad diet is basically that's not natural, and we need to work on those things.
Yeah, I think those are the key things. I don't like the word natural because I just think natural just means anything that happens in the world is natural because it's occurring in nature, but it's not what our minds are well adapted to function in. That's not the right conditions for our minds to function in. And I think we can, I give all these caveats throughout our talk, but these are the things I can say categorically. We're not exercising enough, we're not sleeping correctly, and more than anything, social isolation is so prevalent, and that undoubtedly contributes to mental health risk. And these are just problems which we did not have in the past.
All right. I have a couple of clips I'd like you to react to if you don't mind. Is that fine?
Sure.
All right, let me share my screen. All right, here we go.
The human spirit or whatever.
Well, if you look at, genetics are complicated. Obviously, on some level, modern society is very successful. We have 7 billion of us. But as wealth goes up in a society, as modernity goes up in a society, the suicide rate goes up. The depression rate goes up. Schizophrenia goes up in urban environments. They're not good for the human psyche. We evolved to live in groups of 30, 40 people in a harsh environment, totally interreliant on one another for survival. That creates a huge amount of equality within a group and loyalty within a group. That's what we are designed for genetically. Modern society allows the individual to be independent from the group, which is in some ways a great liberation. In other ways, it can lead to a profound alienation and depression.
Yeah, it's...
What do you think of what was said in that clip? Did you manage to? Was it
Yeah.
Clear?
Yeah, I could hear it and see it all fine. Excluding all my pedantic, scientific little pet peeves, which always happens with academic, I actually agreed with the majority of what he said, and certainly with the core messaging there. I think that's very true. And yet, one thing he noted, which I haven't actually mentioned yet, is levels of equality, because another really important risk factor for one's mental health is inequality of any kind, whether that be social status or economic inequality. And in hunter-gatherers, they're egalitarian. And by that, I mean, there are no political hierarchies. There's no one who has high status insofar as they can tell you what to do. There are no chiefs or like dominant leaders.
There are no chiefs.
Yeah,
From everything, like in movies and TV shows, there's always a chief.
yeah, it's just a
But based on-
caricature.
Not correct.
Yeah, hunter-gatherers. I mean, there are hunter-gatherers are sometimes split into two categories, which are simple, complex, or immediate return and delayed return. But most people, a lot of the work is with immediate return hunter-gatherers, and a lot of anthropologists think immediate return hunter-gatherers are more representative of our evolutionary history. And in these societies, there are no political hierarchies or, dominant chiefs. The idea
Immediate
is
returns, they basically consume resources as soon as they get them. They're
exactly.
correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And if you have no storage mechanism, you can't get any inequality in wealth because there is no material wealth. There is no storage of resources or building up of harvests or ownership of land. So there's no economic inequality. And equally, everyone's so interdependent because everyone needs to share meat with each other. Even if I'm the best hunter, there are going to be some days I don't get food because there's just so much luck involved as well. So I rely on other people on those days to share meat with me. And as such, I can't rely on them and then the next day be telling them, oh, I want you to do this. I'm your leader. I'm your boss. So you get political equality as well. And that's one thing. You only really find that in hunter-gatherers. And now we live with hierarchies, either implicit or explicit. And again, very well established that this.
So can I go to my boss tomorrow and tell him I haven't evolved to have you in my life?
You can say that your brain is not well adapted to, well, it's not I haven't evolved. Again, I'm giving all these, I'm being scientifically pedantic over haven't evolved. But you can say that humans, for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, we didn't have hierarchies. And as such, we have aversive responses to being subordinated.
All right. I'll let you know if I get fired.
Okay.
So I have one more clip and one last question, and then we can conclude.
Sure.
So let me just share the second clip. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, share.
Morning till night. You wake up, you hunt for food, you get home, celebration, everyone's happy that the men brought the food back, the women, gathered the berries. We have a big dinner celebration because every meal you got to be grateful for. Dance party by the fire, and you're out. A couple fart jokes and you're out. Repeat the next day. There's no time to be like bored and sad and upset. Morning till night.
What do you think of what was said in the clip?
I agree with that one less. There's too much generalization there on several levels. So you've got so much variation in terms of what men and women do. You have some societies where women actually bring back more calories and food than men. You have some societies where men and women both hunt. In the AgTA, women sometimes go spear fishing, or younger girls certainly do. So that aspect of, women gather the berries and men hunt is so variable. As for not being bored and that there's no time to be bored, it's just, he was sort of implying it's day to night. Get food, then eat food, then sleep. I don't think that's the case. We spoke earlier about the working hours. It's certainly not, working hours are often not going to take up all the time. So there is, at times sitting around. It's very hard to measure boredom, and, you've got your friends around and your family around. So socially, you're probably less bored a lot of the time. But that said, I feel like the Bayaka sometimes they're a bit bored. They're sometimes a bit like, oh, they're very excited to see us all the time because it's something new, right? You could argue that to counter his point, he was talking about the repetitiveness of their life and how it's structured in this way. Well, repetitiveness is always going to be less exciting than flux. So I'm not sure that you could say they're never bored. I'm not sure you could say they're never sad. That their children die often. That's going to make them sad. So yes, I think there was a lot of caricatures there, and that really happens a lot when we talk about our ancestors or hunter gatherers. There's like this idea that there's the chief alpha male who dominates all the women in these hierarchies, and men go out and hunt, and then no one's got time to be dealing with emotion. Yeah, yeah. I didn't like the second clip so much, but there's something in it.
Okay. I have one last question for you. So, Dr. Chaudhary, you're one of many people who studied mental disorders between Western industrial. Let me try this one more time. Okay. So, Dr. Chaudhary, you've studied, mental disorders, the difference between mental disorders in Western societies, industrialized Western societies, and hunter-gatherer societies. So this is a very difficult question. I asked myself this question, I couldn't answer it. So after you live a wonderful life, you're very happy, and now you find out you're going to be reborn. And you have two choices. I think you know where I'm going here.
Yeah.
Would you choose to be born to random parents today in a Western industrialized society, or choose to be born in a random hunter-gatherer tribe more than 10,000 years ago?
That's a great question. And I'm sure, I would have thought about this a while ago or been asked about it, but weirdly, I haven't really thought about this, at least for a long time. What would I prefer?
I'll tell you what I was thinking about. I was thinking that I've lived the Western industrial. Actually, I'm going to bias your answer. Never mind. Yeah, go ahead. Keep thinking.
I think I would actually go for Western industrialized society still, because maybe I wouldn't get to live 30 to 50% of hunter-gatherer infants or children don't make it to adulthood. So at least I've got more certainty that much more certainty that I'll actually get to live a full life if I'm born in the West. Whether I think I'd be happier is a different question if I did make it to adulthood. And maybe then I'm less sure, probably the hunter-gatherers. But yeah, I'd go for the West for that reason.
And that's probably a lot of the reasons why hunter-gatherers try to maybe integrate into modern societies, because they think they're going to be happier. Would you say that's the main reason?
Yeah.
Or more comfortable?
Yeah.
Or like a better life? I don't think they're thinking of mental disorders when they take the leap.
Yeah, I think they see opportunities and things they don't have, and they want them, or they want to have them, or they like the opportunities. So yeah, I think a better life actually is a good way of phrasing it. It's a vague term, but I think actually it's probably appropriately vague for that decision, because it encompasses a lot of things. Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Nikhil Chaudhary from the University of Cambridge.